Welcome to Chapter 10 of Intro to Psychology. In this video, we'll be talking about sexual behavior. So there is lots that has been said and that has been publicized and that is in the media about sex differences in the brain, about how men and women's brains differ. But unfortunately, a lot of what is said in the media is not really reflected in modern research in psychology and neuroscience. Modern neuroscience research has not identified many decisive or category defining differences between the brains of men and women. Many of the research studies that do report such large or significant differences are often based on small sample sizes where there are, maybe 20 men and 20 women in a sample, and they find some remarkable differences, but those differences are not replicated in larger samples. So, for example, there was a very popular 1995 study reported or published in a top journal that found that language processing is spread more evenly across both cerebral hemispheres in women's brains, kind of reflecting this common notion that women's brains are more interconnected and that they think more broadly and not as narrowly as men. And so it kind of reinforced just the existing notions and beliefs that many people had, and went very, very far, despite listing many limitations in the study. And so a larger meta-analysis in 2008 that examined that research question more broadly didn't find that those differences between men and women held up. And a meta-analysis is a study of a study. So the word meta implies a higher level. So it is a research study of research studies, where you take multiple research studies and compare their findings and do some mathematical computations to see if the results of all these studies together are still significant when the individual results are significant. And they found, in this case, that these language processing findings were not still significant. And so the basic conclusion is that the brain is not more gendered than other organs in the body, than the liver or the kidneys or the heart. Much of how our brains express themselves in our psychology and in our behavior and in our personality has more to do with individual differences than it has to do with our sex or gender. But regarding sex and gender, there are some important regions of the brain to be aware of, such as the nucleus accumbens, the hypothalamus, as well as the amygdala. And particularly the role of the hypothalamus is important to know about. So in much of what we know about sex in the brain comes from research on rats. So we know that damage to the medial preoptic area of the hypothalamus completely disrupts a male rat's ability to engage in sexual behaviors, but it does not affect their sexual motivation. So in these studies, when they induce damage to the hypothalamus, these rats would not be able to perform sexually, but they still had the desire to chase after female rats. And so it shows that our sexual behavior is really controlled by many facets of our brains, and that the ability to perform sexual functions and our motivation to do so are managed by different systems in the brain. And then in humans, we also see the same thing. Many disorders found in the DSM, where there is some kind of impaired sexual functioning, we also see some evidence suggesting that there's some abnormal functioning of the hypothalamus. And that might be limited to that area of the brain, whereas other parts of the brain or the sexual system, such as the endocrine glands, work just fine. So we mentioned that neuroscience is not very conclusive on the differences between men and women's brains, and it's very much the same pattern when it comes to sexual orientation. So when we talk about sexual orientation, we're talking about an emotional or erotic attraction towards another individual. And what we find is that individuals who are homosexual, that there is some evidence to suggest that there is some influences in development, biological as well as sociological, that may lead certain individuals to have a greater predisposition to identify as homosexual later in life. But the ultimate causes and mechanisms of sexual orientation and development are not very well known. It's not something that we can pinpoint to one experience or one gene or one biological mechanism. It's something that's very, very difficult to examine and determine cause and effect because, as we mentioned earlier in our chapter on research, answering the question, what causes some people to be gay or lesbian or bisexual, that question requires longitudinal studies, very well controlled and complex longitudinal studies where you're following people for many years over time. And it's very, very difficult to do and establish cause and effect at the same time. So probably the most unfortunate part of this lecture is that there's so much that we don't know when it comes to sex, when it comes to gender, when it comes to gender identity, when it comes to sexual orientation and expression. There's so much that has been posited out there in literature and psychology and neuroscience, but there aren't many definitive answers. And in the fields of psychology, neuroscience, biology, and sociology, there's very many differing perspectives. What we do know is some of the terms that we can use to describe the effects or the representations or the expressions of sexual orientation and gender identity. So for the remainder of this video, I'll just be going over some of the main terms to know that can be useful in multiple situations. So when we talk about sex, we were referring to biological differences between males and females, such as genitalia, as well as genetic differences, chromosomes, and the like. Whereas when we're talking about gender or also gender identity, we're talking about a broader range of characteristics that pertain to kind of a spectrum between masculinity and femininity. So it's often said that sex and gender align and that, for most people they align, but it's not always the case. Sex is a biological construct, whereas gender, at least as promoted in psychology and sociology, is a social construct. It's something that is determined by society. So for example, the notion that baby clothes for male babies are blue, or toys and clothes and everything that male babies have, those things are given typically a light blue color, and then when it's a girl, then we typically give it a pink color, their clothes, their toys, and whatnot. We've already studied color and vision. There's no scientific reason for why blue belongs to males and pink belongs to females. Those colors are just artifacts of light waves that are absorbed or reflected from different objects. There's no biological reason for why blue means male or pink means female. Those are social constructs or aspects of society that over time have become popular and have become accepted. And so it's important to differentiate between the sex, a biological construct, and gender, a sociological construct. When we're talking about this, we also talk about gender dysphoria. So gender dysphoria in particular is a psychiatric disorder where individuals who do not identify as the gender that most people assume they are experience some kind of distress. And so it's a psychiatric disorder that is found in the DSM-5 that we'll talk about the DSM in particular in a later chapter, which means that it has a specific criteria. So not everyone who does not or express themselves or experience life in the gender that they were assigned at birth. Not everyone who experiences that phenomenon also has necessarily gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is something that must be present for at least 6 months, as well as must result in some real life dysfunction or distress, as well as a host of other DSM-5 criteria before assigning that label to someone. So not every transgender person experiences gender dysphoria. So here's a slide just highlighting again the differences between sex and gender. Once again, when we talk about sex, we're talking about a biological construct, chromosomes, organs, genitalia, hormones, whereas when we talk about gender, we're talking about culturally defined or socially defined characteristics or attributes, such as men being more aggressive or being more risk taking. That is a culturally defined value. Whereas a woman being more caring naturally, we tend to say, or being more oriented towards being emotional. Those are not firm biological ideas. Those are socially defined ideas. And lastly, it's important to highlight that when we use the term LGBTQ or LGBTQIA plus, that we are referring to at least two main groups of constructs. There is sex and gender, and then there's sexual orientation. So those are two different aspects that are often conflated that should really be talked about separately, but we commonly lump them together when we talk about these issues of or LGBTQ issues. So there's some obvious terms here that you'll want to know for the quiz that are probably more familiar to you, as well as some other terms that are less frequently used. So lesbian, a woman who is primarily attracted to women; gay, a man who is primarily attracted to men. Also, we sometimes use the word gay to encompass gay men, as well as lesbian women. Bisexual, individuals who are attracted to people of their own and the opposite gender. And then transgender. So now we're talking about gender identity, a person whose gender identity differs from the sex assigned at birth. Then there's the term transsexual, which is an outdated term that we no longer use for people who formerly used to describe people who had gone through surgery to change their gender. Now we more commonly just refer to them by their gender identity. So a trans man, a person who is assigned female at birth, but whose gender identity is now that of a man, or trans woman, a person who was a male at birth, but their gender identity is that of a female. Then there's the terms queer, which is probably the largest umbrella term, just the most inclusive term to describe the many variabilities that we see in the LGBTQ plus community. Then there are terms such as intersex, so that's talking specifically about sexual anatomy, genitalia, who may have different expressions of chromosomes as well. And then two other sexual orientations to know, asexual and pansexual. So asexual are individuals, a surprising amount of the population who do not experience sexual attraction or desire for any group of people. And then there are individuals who are pansexual who experience sexual desire towards people in general, regardless of their gender identity or their sexual orientation. So the most broad form of sexual attraction. And then lastly, there's the term ally. And hopefully all of us can be allies and affirm the humanity of individuals in the LGBTQ plus community who have been maligned and viewed as subhuman in many ways for centuries. And luckily now we see that trend changing, particularly in academia and in other parts of society.